So let's move into some of the symptoms of mold toxicity. There are a number of them, and I've just selected, this is not, by all means, this is not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the big ones that we see. Chronic sinusitis. So if you chronically have inflamed or impacted sinuses where you have trouble breathing, a lot of times we'll see people with sleep apnea as a result of the chronic sinusitis or recurring infections. And so a lot of times what happens with chronic sinusitis is doctors give antibiotics. What's interesting about this is most people with chronic sinusitis, this is a mold issue. This is a mold problem. There's actually a study published, I think it was Journal of American Medical Association, it was about 15, 20 years ago. They did a major study on the people with chronic sinusitis, and what they found is the vast majority of them did not have a bacterial infection, but they had mold growing in their sinus cavities. And so if you take an antibiotic to treat what a doctor's calling an upper respiratory infection, but it's not being caused by bacteria, but being caused by mold, then you actually worsen the mold problem, right? Because antibiotics knock out your good flora. They don't just knock out, potential bad flora, they knock out good guys. And so when you knock out healthy microbial flora, you make more room, you create more growth potential for mold to go out of control. So chronic antibiotics actually make a mold problem worse. This is why it's so critical to not just take an antibiotic for any old reason, right? I think the doctors hand them out like candy, but there is a consequence to chronic antibiotic use, and one of them is chronic mold exposure or chronic mold overgrowth. It's one of the quickest ways to get there. We see muscle and joint pain. This is a very, very common symptom. One study recently done found that 51% of people exposed to water damage molds, water damage building molds, had joint pain compared to people who weren't being exposed. Crushing fatigue. You could sleep 12 hours. You could sleep 15 hours. You wake up exhausted. This is actually what happened to me. I was in black mold. We had hundreds of thousands of black mold spores growing in the walls of our home, and one of the things that was happening to me was I'm an early riser. I like to get up at least 5 a.m. But I wasn't able to get up. I was barely peeling myself off the pillow at 7:30, 8 o'clock to get my day going. So this severe fatigue, no matter what you do, no matter what supplements you take, no matter how much you sleep, if you're suffering with crushing fatigue and you don't have anemia, remember mold is a major, major cause of this. Sleep issues, trouble going to sleep is another major problem. There are some chemicals that mycotoxins cause you to produce in your immune system that actually activate the brain and can keep you awake and stop you from going to sleep. A lot of these are inflammatory. If you've heard, there's this term, SEERS, which many of you may have heard of if you've been researching mold at all. It stands for chronic inflammatory response syndrome, and it's oftentimes caused as a result of chronic mold exposure. Neurological symptoms, so migraine headaches. And so migraine is a neurological problem, but you'll also see with migraines tremendous brain fog. What happens to people in mold is they almost develop like an Alzheimer's style or dementia style of illness. I've seen people come to see me where their dementia was so severe. I've seen wives not recognize their husbands as a result of mold exposure. I've seen cases where I had to finish the sentence, every other sentence, because the person was just so struggling to try to find the right word because they couldn't pull it from their brain. They couldn't get it from their brain to their lips, to their tongue. And so that heavy brain fog where you don't remember things well, but you also can't focus, you can't concentrate, you have word recall problems, all part of the neurological consequences of mold, which we now know. There was a federal court case done. This was actually a number of years ago, but a woman by the name of Shelley Frederico, she basically proved in a federal court battle that mold could cause damage to the brain using three-dimensional MRI technology called NeuroQuant. So this is just one of the other types of tests that can be done that helps you to understand how mold may be impacting you neurologically through damaging your brain directly. We know severe mood swings, irritability as well can occur, and this, just like with anything else that affects you and makes you feel bad, mood swings can come with that. We know hormone disruption. Some mycotoxins mimic estrogen. There's one in particular called zearalenone, and that particular mycotoxin is an estrogen mimicker, so it can create, in men it can create apathy and depression, in women it can create estrogen dominance types of symptoms. And because, again, it's a pseudo, it's not technically an estrogen, but because it mimics estrogen, it can bind to estrogen receptors, creating an estrogen imbalance. We know mold causes immune dysfunction, and particularly depression, so it reduces immune function, leading to a whole sequelae of different types of problems, a sequelae of different types of immune reactions. A lot of you here, I'll point this out, if you've been told you have mast cell activation problems, MCAS, right? Mast cell activation syndrome, MCAS. This is actually a major hallmark of mold exposure. I get this all the time as people come to me, they've been diagnosed with mast cell disease and they don't really have mast cell disease. What they actually have is mold problems. And when we take care of the mold problems, the mast cell activation stops, right? And so they can get a semblance of normalcy again by dealing with the environmental poison they were being exposed to. But it's been very well documented. We actually know that mycotoxins, mold exposure can trigger mast cells trigger them to degranulate on a hyper intense basis, leading to the symptoms of mast cell activation. Chronic sugar cravings. If you're chronically seeking out sugar, this is a very common problem associated with, particularly with the candidiasis. So the yeast overgrowth, right? Yeast will create massive craving for carbohydrate sugars, and neurologically, they'll hijack your brain and make you want to eat sugar. This is where some of you may be trying to cut back on sugar and you just feel like it's such an overwhelming craving and you buckle. This could possibly be, again, a yeast issue. I mentioned apathy and depression before, both symptoms. These are, again, part of the neurological component, but also part of the hormone component to how mold can impact you. Skin rashes, very, very common to see eczema as a result of chronic mold exposure. And then mold growing in the nail beds. And I'll show you a better picture even than that. This is from an actual client of mine who came in. You can see here, you can see the yellow discoloration within the nail beds themselves, and you can see the frayed edges. This is mold growing underneath the nail bed. So you can also see it here, all right, that dryness growing into the toes. And then you can see here in the nail beds, this white discoloration, like at the tip of the nail. That's mold growing underneath that nail. You can see it through all of the nail beds. And so when you find out where that's coming from, where the environmental source of mold or candidiasis is coming from, oftentimes it effectively goes away. Now, a lot of people with these findings have autoimmune diseases and they're being treated with immunosuppressing medications, the disease-modifying antirheumatics, or sometimes in some cases they're on the biologic medications which suppress the immune system. Remember what I said about yeast earlier? Yeast overgrowth is a consequence of immune system suppression. These are opportunistic yeasts and they start growing on you when you don't have a strong enough immune system to support yourself. So if you've been healthy your whole life and all of a sudden you start getting fungal toenail infections or fungal infections, you need to suspect that there may be mold either growing in you, creating a problem, or that there's mold growing outside of you externally. This is one of the symptoms I had. I didn't have it to this extent, but on my big toe, one of my big toes, I started to get yellow discoloration, mold growth underneath. I was like, I'm a healthy guy. Why is this happening to me? It was one of my first clue-ins that I was actually in a moldy environment. So again, if that's happening to you, the likelihood that you've got a mold problem is 100%.
Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.